call to the table Gisele Toassa and her very distinguished researcher group. Gisele, she is a PhD in school psychology and development, professor at the Federal University of Goiás, performed her postdoc research at the Program of History and Theory of Psychology, York University, Canada. She has a group that wrote a test together, and she will be presenting the group as she goes along. Gisele?
Hello, everyone. Здравствуйте. Honored with the invitation of Carla to be part of this panel session. I shall present the work Knitting a Vygotskian Network in Brazil, and particularly the part introducing the research group Vershina. So I need to share my screen here. Just a second. Okay. My objectives here are presenting a brief overview of the spreading of Vygotsky's ideas in chat in Brazil, as well as introducing the research group Vershina, Foundations of Vygotskian Psychology, to our amazing public. First of all, I would like to talk about the early days of Vygotsky in Brazil. The first amateur translation of his text, of one of his texts, was from Italian to Portuguese in the middle of the 70s. Hello? Can you hear and see me? Please?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. At first, the interpretation of USA cognitivist scholars was the only one available on Vygotsky. The Latin American networking of socialist psychologists also contributed to publicize ideas from Soviet psychologists. As, for example, back on the 80s, an important research group located at Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo started reading Evaluative prior to Vygotsky. In the spreading of Soviet psychology, the 80s were marked by the protagonism of two São Paulo institutions, Pontifical University Catholic of São Paulo and State University of Campinas, Unicamp, respectively in social psychology and education. They were also two important universities for the survival of the leftist thinking in the years of Brazilian military dictatorship that went on from 64 to 85. Pedagogues, psychologists, and other professionals sought critical, practical, theoretical perspectives within the context in the making of the country's new democracy. Started reading Vygotsky then. Vygotsky appeared as an alternative to Skinner and Piaget in education, mostly, that were very strong at that point, and still are, mostly Piaget. We note, therefore, that there were three entry points for Soviet psychology in Brazil, through other Latin American countries, notably from Cuba, from the United States, and from Europe, with the work of Spaniards in Brazil, in university or in advisory to educational policies. For this reason, to this day, Vygotsky is reading as a social interactionist or social constructivist, that is more Spanish-like, is quite strong. Vygotsky was late in arriving, but he gained such a momentum, such an importance, that we can claim that Brazil has become one of the most Vygotskian countries in the world, together with the United States, probably. Sarmento in 2006 shows that hundreds of theses and dissertations already referred to the author over the years 86 to 2001. For the late Vygotsky's Brazilian boom, it was crucial to incorporate references to the author in at least one of the national educational laws, as well as educational policies in some states. Vygotsky started being studied in the most diverse fields of education and has become part of the university curriculum for teachers training. At the same time, Vygotsky occupies space in social psychology and in school psychology. Currently, at least two journals specialized in Chat's contributions. We had also a clash between Marxist versus non-Marxist scholars. This new intellectual and political scenario in which the author's work was ranged produced an important clash about the denomination of his theory and mostly his theoretical philosophical roots. Newton Duarte's work, Vygotsky and Learn to Learn, a critique about neoliberal and postmodern appropriations of Vygotskian theory, it was published in 2001, marked a new identitarian space, that of the Marxist Vygotskian scholars. A relatively diverse space that includes, in turn, a range of relationships with other Marxist theorists. In minor scale, leftist Vygotskians also study Spinoza, a philosopher who lived between 1632 to 77. In this ambience, several other Soviet authors began to thrive in the educational scenario, which was expressed by the holding of events, the creation of new research groups, and the publishing of new translations of Vygotsky and his circle. The team studied the group as well as the historical and theoretical studies that seek to present themselves on the international landscape have multiplied from 2001. So we have a little bit of a change in this Marxist interpretations of scenario of Vygotsky that now is more diverse. Not everyone, I would say, agrees with Newton Duarte. Here we have a little bit of a survey that was carried out by Flavia Asbar and her group, and that together we published in English this year. Research that was done in a database, official database, the Directory of the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development, CNPq, on groups that formally indicated Vygotsky's theory as guiding their work. So it's pretty interesting. We can see here the growing of these, the number of this Vygotsky scholarship in Brazil, the number of groups registered. We can see from 92, in spite of its creation in 87 at the University of Campinas, the first group was registered. 2010, 53, and less than years later, we have 115. Another interesting data is about the name of the theory that is still quite diverse in Brazil as well as worldwide, I would say. We can see mostly historical cultural theory being used in other denominations too. The field of knowledge that prevails is still education, 58%, followed by psychology, and then other areas. Mostly arts, literature, and closed fields. We have only 10% in those fields. This reality, I would say, has remained constant from the start of the readings of Vygotsky in Brazil. We also have some data on the administrative domain and that these groups are located. So they are mostly in public universities, federal, 50%. There are the majority of public universities in Brazil. Then state universities, mostly in São Paulo and Paraná, 38%, and private and others, especially Catholic universities, 11%. So we see a portrait of the Brazilian graduate programs, we can say. Also, we have a few data on the regions of the country in that Vygotsky is studied. Mostly southeast and south, which shows also the reality of the graduate programs, but also the reality of the spreading of Vygotsky that stronger, we can say, in these regions, followed by Northeast and Midwest in almost equal terms. Here we also have which one are the main topics studied by these research groups. So we can see human development, psychological phenomena and processes, formation of the psyche in its relation with schooling processes, work processes, public policy analysis, school and education psychology, and epistemological, methodological, and historical studies of chat, health, violence, inclusion and special needs, sexuality, human rights, social psychology, aesthetic dimension, and other topics as neuropsychology and racial identity. We can see there is, they are in order, and in decreasing order. What still prevails is human development and topics related to education. That is very consistent from the start of the readings of Vygotsky in Brazil. In this aspect, there was little change. We have, unfortunately, a history of poor translations and misinterpretations. From the onset of readings of Vygotsky until now, we see mutilated, censored editions being published, poor translations from the mutilated editions, or even from full texts in Russian, neglect of the political underpinnings in which this psychology was developed, and conceptual interpretations based on misreadings of the history of psychology and or of Soviet science. The applied research in historical, cultural, and activity theory prevails over studies in foundations of Vygotsky psychology. As a result, we have fragmentation and dispersion of groups and researchers that carry on combining numerous Vygotsky combos, a mixes of his contributions with many other authors in different places of the ideological and theoretical spectrum. Vygotsky theory is broadly regarded as unfinished and or insufficient. So we can see these attempts at mixing his contributions with other authors. Most in a very broad, as I said, ideological spectrum. Most dominant research groups prepare new scholars in these old practices. Few people got really acquainted with new trends in historical and theoretical interpretation of Vygotsky that strive for performing a more accurate research. Some of these rare people, we can say, are us. We decided to form a new group, and we thank you, Carla, for inviting us for this presentation. In fact, this is our first act in an international, for international audience. Our objective is to disseminate recent production about the foundations of Vygotsky's Marxist psychology and some guidelines of our collaboration. First, critical presentism as a sensible historical attitude towards classic authors whose contribution remain relevant for present psychology. A second guideline, sharing the works of international scholars that have been performing a solid study of Vygotsky in Russian and strive to criticize the blind association between Vygotsky and his collaborators. So some people believe that there was a close continuing of Vygotsky's works by, for example, Davidov, and even that Davidov was a close pupil or pupil of Vygotsky. What the historical facts naturally won't agree. Critical psychology that sheds light on Vygotsky using reflexivity as well as a leftist perspective. After some time of informal collaboration, thereafter we started our new group during the pandemics. We proposed an extension course in 10 lessons that counted originally with 100 participants, and it was uploaded to YouTube. This is the URL that you can follow to get to our course. The name is in Portuguese, Fundamentos da Psicologia Vygotskiana. Researchers with a degree in psychology, but from different areas of expertise, with a common objective of exploring and further investigating the foundations of Vygotsky's ideas. We believe then that Vygotskian psychology emerged as an original articulation of achievements in different fields of knowledge whose limits go way beyond psychology, going deeper into other sciences, philosophy, and art. In the background of Vygotsky's theory, there is an emancipation project that goes together with the high psychology, as it's been translated to English, or even peak psychology, that in Russian means Vershina Psychology, a term that is being spread in international scholarship lately.
I don't know if Gisele's internet connection fell. I will see here. Let me see. She's not.
No, internet connection is good. Something.
Yes.
Hello, please. Sorry.
She's back.
Problem with the internet. I'll share my screen again. Just a second. This term, high psychology, is being spread in international scholarship lately. So we felt like a term that expresses our commitment to the future as well as the past of the historical cultural psychology and its commitment to emancipation. Here we have the lines. Here we have the lines of our research. First, historical and theoretical foundations of Vygotsky psychology. Wagner will speak more about it. The second, Artistic Foundations of Vygotsky Psychology. Priscilla will talk more about it. And third, neuropsychological approach to Vygotsky and Luria. Isabel will talk more about it too. Then we have here the course plan that we have done from May to July in the current year. The contents of this course, it went through this axis of our work, starting from history of the Soviet Union and its Marxism, history of the Vygotsky circle, the psychology and Vygotsky as it was interpreted by Vygotsky and Luria. Followed by the philosophical foundations with an introduction differentiating ontological, epistemological, and ethical-political foundations from psychology, and other sources of his psychology, as well as methodological foundations, followed by artistic foundations of his work, the texts of theater criticism, Vygotsky psychology of art, aesthetic education, and his scientific foundations, mostly how he and Luria arranged a new science. They conceived a new science, the science of neuropsychology. We have then the relationship between matter and spirit, psychological systems, theoretical premises for the construction of a new general psychology, the case of neuropsychology then, and as well as a clinical reasoning in the qualitative neuropsychology approach and presentation of basic groups. So as an applied field, in a certain way, of the previous premises, previous conception. Here we have our distribution in the country. In Goiás, myself and Rebecca Calgaro in the first line, and here some beautiful pictures from Rio Grande do Norte, here, right at the corner of Brazil. And our researchers, Isabel, Pamela, and Hansel, a Cuban student, neuropsychological approach to Vygotsky and Luria. As well here, so the state where I was born, and here University of São Paulo, State University of São Paulo, Unesp, and the researchers, you see São Paulo capital, and here the campus of State University of São Paulo, and here then we have the contributors who are João Batista Martins, professor, Wagner Schmidt, PhD student, Eduardo Moura, and in São Paulo capital, Priscila Nascimento Marques, who is responsible for artistic foundations of Vygotsky psychology. So, thank you everyone, большое спасибо. Here we have, so the URL for our course and our channel at YouTube, as well as some of my addresses. I called then Wagner to perform his presentation. Wagner, are you around?
Yeah, I'm
and thank
here.
you, Carla.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Gisele. So, my name is Wagner. I will do a quick presentation. Let me just share my screen. Just a moment. Okay. Okay, are you seeing the presentation? Just confirmation, please.
Yes, we are.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to present some of the questionings about the historical and theoretical foundations of Vygotskian psychology. This is the way that, sorry, I don't speak Russian, so if I pronounce something wrong, I'm really sorry. Also, my English, I know that's not very good, lots of accents. So the name of our group, Vershina, and I will try to show some of the questionings and the directions that our group are taking in the foundations of Vygotskian psychology. I will mostly read. I hope this helps people to comprehend. I know that most people here are not native English speakers, so I hope this helps, but to make the presentation a little boring, sorry. As Gisele said, our group is composed from people from all around Brazil, like Gisele and Rebecca. Gisele is also in our line of research. And here are some photos from Rio Grande do Norte, where we have Pamela, Hansel, and Isabel that are in the neuropsychological line of research. Here is the state that I am right now. I was born in São Paulo, capital of the state, but now I am living in the countryside. João Batista Martins is my PhD advisor, and I was also advisor of Eduardo, and we collaborate together. We have some texts published, mostly in Portuguese, and also Priscilla is also here in São Paulo, but in the capital. So these are the researchers on this line, Gisele, Wagner, me, João Batista, and Eduardo. So a quick introduction. In this presentation, I plan to show only some provocations from our current understanding of the historical and theoretical foundations of Vygotsky psychology for our research group. Some or even most of these already know, but we understand that these discussions are important in the Brazilian scene and our research. Our workings are being compiled in a book right now, initially in Portuguese, but we long for have it translated in other languages like English and Spanish. In the spirit that Vygotskian materialism was a variant of psychological materialism, we have been concerned with questions such as, what are the main philosophical perspectives that Vygotsky engaged in dialogue with? How does he articulate them? Are there differences between materialism, monism, and Marxism? What are the consequences of these dialogues between Vygotsky and philosophical materialism for Marxist reflections on the object of psychology, its ontological, epistemological, aesthetic, and ethical political aspects within the scope of a triadic psychology, general, particular, and concrete psychology? So I will begin with some general problematizations. Some of them were already covered by Professor Verasov in the previous speech, but I hope this is still interesting. And then talk more about some of the problems here in Brazil, especially. In order to avoid the conspicuous tendency in the national and international Vygotskiana to merge Vygotsky and Luria's ideas with activity theory and other Marxist authors of Soviet psychology, we conduct historic comparisons of their achievement, for example, the works of João Batista Martins, as well as explorations with Vygotsky concepts and methodology in new contexts, like my research on role-playing games. For some historical problematizations, we take into account the works of Anton Janistik. By addressing the story of Soviet psychology in the early 20th century, he identifies several groups that participated in Vygotsky's life and got along soon before his death, what he called Vygotskian circles. He understands that such an approach brings new elements to understand the process of development of science. The author questions the traditional historical narrative that claims historical cultural psychology as a perspective first developed by the Troika, the trio Vygotsky, Leontiev, and Luria. And Janisky questioned this history pointing out that from the point of view of theoretical articulation and joint production, there is a greater approximation between Vygotsky and Luria and not much between Vygotsky and Leontiev. Also, Vygotsky letters bring some elements that reveal his concerns with the construction and consolidation of these groups, stimulating a collective work among people who shared his interests. On the relevance of collective work, Vygotsky expresses in several letters one aspect of the relations that he established with his partners, that of welcoming, that of respect, and that of companionship. Indeed, we can see in this text that Vygotsky has this respect also for other authors, the authors that he is in dialogue with, even when he is criticizing him, like Piaget, for example. Concerning this non-academic material, Vershina has provided us with the analysis of diaries, notebooks left by Vygotsky, which are deposited in the archives of his family. Analyses point out that Vygotski's involvement with the Soviet revolutionary ideas are revealed in several ways. Here, it's worth highlighting her work with René van der Veer, who analyzes the personal notes written by Vygotsky during his trip to London in 1925. When he went to participate in the 8th International Conference on the Education of the Deaf, which took place from 2024 July. In this work, they present us with an excerpt where Vygotsky makes the following reflection about his stay there, about Soviet Union and about the revolution. So this is a direct quote from one of the notes from Vygotsky. In essence, Russia is the first country in the world. The revolution is our supreme cause. In this room, only one person knows the secret of the genuine education of the deaf mutes, and that person is me. Not because I am more educated than others, but because I was sent by Russia and I speak on behalf of the revolution. So we have some also problematizations of the works of Vygotsky, the distribution, readings, etc. So this conception, that of a revolutionary Marxist psychology in the making, is one of the main characteristics of Vygotsky work. And we can circumscribe his approach to psychological phenomena from two dimensions, that of the historicity of phenomena and that of their dialectical analysis. These two perspectives can be found in his analysis of the state of psychology of his time, especially in the manuscript, The Historical Meaning of Crisis in Psychology, in his approach to human development, in his perspective regarding the relationships between psychological functions developed on his text on psychological systems. Also, concerning Vygotsky's work, it should be noted that its dissemination has several implications for understanding of his theoretical propositions, and it is marked by several problems, such as translation problems, censorship, and editing in his texts. The famous analyzing the reception of Vygotsky's work in the countries of the North Atlantic indicates three forms of appropriation, namely that carried out by cognitivists, culturalists, and those who adhere to the theory of activity. The famous presents us with the three problems regarding this reception, namely, so here I am quoting, not directly, but quoting the famous. The first problem is related to a fragmented reading of Vygotsky's particular ideas, which dominates North Atlantic research without sufficient understanding of the theoretical problem in which these ideas were included. The dialectical understanding of human development has disappeared from the conventional interpretations of Vygotsky's theory, such as cognitivism, cultural psychology, and chat. Furthermore, in conventional interpretations of Vygotsky theory, it is difficult to find the understanding that cultural historical theory is not a closed system of idea that can be applied in a way already prepared in practice, but a dynamic process of development. The second problem is often that of the expansion and application of cultural historical theory in social contexts that are unrelated with the consideration of the social and scientific context of its formation. The reconstruction of theoretical program of cultural historical theory in the social and scientific context of its formation can provide a structure for the assessment of its achievements and limitations. The third problem is related to the simplification of Vygotsky's theory. So Vershina expresses this consideration furthermore. In order to present Vygotsky's theory to the world psychology, Western Vygotskians have simplified and adapted the whole picture to the existing tradition. And the famous goes even further. Many contemporary researchers and professionals have not developed a critical reflection on their own cognitive schemas and their connections with personal, collective, and social practices. These three problems, so now I will talk about this, especially in Brazil. So these three problems here in Brazil led us to notice a sort of confusion between ontology, epistemology, theory, methodology, and method. The discussion of this kind of situation for Vygotsky seems to take place in the realm of epistemology, in which he points out the need to build a theory and methodology based on Marxism and materialism. For example, it seems to us that stressing the need for a Lucatian ontological turn in Vygotsky, as some Brazilian academics energetically emphasize, implies that Vygotsky does not work from a materialistic perspective, and that he would therefore be idealistic, an accusation also made by Leontiev. In defense of Vygotsky, no one can speak better than himself. So here is a quote from the historical meaning of crisis in psychology. In another philosophical systems, such a conception would be unthinkable. When we reject these epistemological and pharmacological premises, the whole conception of the general science falls immediately. As soon as we accept the realistic, objective, the materialistic viewpoint in epistemology and the dialectical viewpoint in logic, and in the theory of scientific knowledge, such a theory becomes impossible. With that new viewpoint, we must immediately accept that reality determines our experience, the object of science and its method, and that it is entirely impossible to study the concepts of any science independent of the reality it represents. So there is also another quote from the chapter 4 from the Thinking and Speech. Once we acknowledge the historical character of verbal thought, we must consider it subject to all the premises of historical materialism, which are valid for any historical phenomenon in human society. It is only to be expected that on this level, the development of behavior will be governed essentially by the general laws of the historical development of human society. I think Vygotsky could not be more clear than in this passage. In the same way, accusing Vygotsky for not using Marx's political economy category seems to us to confuse epistemology with theory. So it would be like wanting to use categories of physics on the study of biology, and an error already discussed in depth by Vygotsky himself, including his well-known statement that psychology needs to build its own capital in the historical meaning of crisis in psychology. Thus, it's clear to us that Vygotsky ontology is in his psychological texts are always seem to start from a realistic and materialistic point of view, in a historical and dialectical perspective. From these foundations, he seems to seek to build an objective for psychology, mostly conscious and sometimes personality or higher psychological functions, as well as a theory and methodology according to the object after an immanent and sublate critical review of idealistic and bourgeois theories. avoiding thus to ignore contemporary production without falling into theoretical and methodological eclecticism. We understand that there is a dialectical movement, that is, a story of changes and understanding as a totality between theory, methodology, and method, between researcher, object of study, and social and historical context. And for this very reason, Vygotsky's work is presented not only as a unfinished work, but also contradictory. A dialectic definition for Vygotsky can be found at the end of chapter 5 of Historical Meaning of Crisis Psychology. It's a very long passage, so I will unfortunately not have time to point it out. So please take a look at it. It is also important to emphasize that we live in a different historical and social moment, and that merely transporting Vygotsky's text to our time and way of doing science implies anachronism, and therefore contradiction with a historical materialist perspective. Currently, scientific rigor requires greater clarity in the differences between philosophical discussions about reality, or ontology, philosophical discussions about knowledge, or epistemology, knowledge about an object, theory, discussions about how to study an object, methodology, the general set of study practice of an object in a specific research method, and the research-specific intervention practicing reality or procedure. So it implies understanding that these discussions occur in the historical, social, political, economic, and academic contexts that determine them and that limit or promote new sublations, as well as the dialectical totality of these discussions in the practice of the researcher or professional psychologist. This becomes even clearer if we consider Vygotsky's idea of unit of analysis. To explain this, he gives us the example that in order to study water, we must look for the unit that still has the characteristics of the total. So although we can break down water into its basic elements, like oxygen and hydrogen, they would not be useful to understand the characteristics of water. In fact, they would be misleading. Therefore, to study water, Vygotsky suggests that we should look at the water molecule. So we, as researchers, we must find the unit of analysis of our researches. This becomes even clearer if we consider Vygotsky's, we believe that it is interesting to think of these units as gestalten or totalities that are more than simple sum of their elements, as our phenomenon, as the archetypical phenomenon in which all the essential characteristics of an entire complex process can be found, with inspiration probably from Goethe and Hegel, and that the plus greater than the sum of the parts of this totality arises precisely from the relations between the parts in time, as for example in the movements of the electrons between the hydrogen and oxygen atoms in the water molecule. So another quote from Vygotsky about this. For dialectical thinking, there's nothing new in the position that the whole does not arise mechanically by means of a sum of separate parts, but has specifically unique properties and qualities which cannot be deduced from a single combining of qualities of the parts. The situation described by the Fermus regarding the reception and appropriation of Vygotsky's works is very similar to the Brazilian reality, and also pushes us to the questioning above on the confusion problem. As we have pointed out elsewhere, there are several problems in the process of disseminating, teaching, and researching the Vygotskian work in our country. His selected works have not yet been fully translated in Portuguese. There are problems with translations. Access to Vygotsky's works occurs mainly through commentators and through the books The Social Formation of Mind and Thought and Language. Bibliographic material that presents serious problems of censorship, translation, edition, and so on. as was already explained, researching the research groups that work with Vygotskian theory that are registered with the Ministry of Science found 150 research groups distributed in Brazil. The researchers identified a variety of terms used to characterize the groups. This research reveals to us the various interpretive perspectives to which Vygotsky works was and is submitted, further increasing the difficulty of understanding and applying history. I will try to finish. I think my time is running out. So, with the perspective of analyzing the interlocution between these research groups, our previous research groups analyzed the relationships established between the authors, starting with their quotations. We observed a very high frequency of authors who cite members of their own research groups. If, on one hand, this perspective consolidates the group, on the other hand, the theory produces not renewed or updated. With the perspective of analyzing the interlocution between these research groups, we analyzed the relationships established between the authors. All these questions make us reflect on the need to broaden our discussion on dissemination, teaching, research of Vygotskian theory in Brazil, and in this direction, closing my speech, we agree with the Fermus, who warns us. The new disclosure of Vygotsky's life and new editions of Vygotsky's writings are necessary, but not a sufficient condition for a deeper understanding of his theory. In my opinion, the creative reconstruction of Vygotsky theory is possible based on the investigation of three interconnected aspects: the historical and cultural context of its emergence and development, the specific conjuncture in the story of science, the scientific context and connections between historical and cultural theory and other theories, and the path of Vygotsky's life and the development of his scientific program during his lifetime. So here are some of the references from my presentation. And now I pass on to Priscilla to make her presentation.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Good. I will share my screen. Here. Yes? You can see me, right?
Yes, we can. It's perfect.
Good. So first of all, thank you very much to the organizers of this amazing event and very important event for cultural historical psychology. It's an honor to present for the first time our group in this event. And so our presentation is about this group, Vershina, Foundations of Vygotskian Psychology. I am Priscilla Marques. Let me just, oh, sorry. I'll just close this here. Yes. I'm Priscilla Marques. I come from São Paulo, and I recently finished a postdoc at the University of São Paulo, where I also got a master's and a doctoral degree in Russian literature and culture. Originally, I have a background in psychology. However, having finished my bachelor's degree in psychology and being interested in Vygotsky's psychology of art, I could not really find a graduate program to pursue this interest in postgraduate level, although there were a few researchers, but not in São Paulo, so I ended up doing my graduate studies in the language faculty. So for this reason, I decided to enter a graduate program in Russian studies in the language faculty of University of São Paulo. There, I had the chance to attend courses in topics such as Russian language, Russian culture, and Russian literature. In this context, I carried out my research, starting with a dissertation about Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, an analysis that was based on Vygotsky's methodology presented in Psychology of Art. And later, I wrote a thesis about Vygotsky's early writings. my PhD thesis. Throughout this period, I have made several translations of Vygotsky and also of other non-literary and literary texts. So I kind of stepped aside of psychology to return to psychology with a different formation and a different set of skills that maybe can be helpful at this point. Coming from this trajectory, I was invited by Professor Toassa to become a part of the course that was previously mentioned, and later to this research group, Vershina, where I'm responsible for the research line artistic foundations of Vygotsky's psychology. This line deals with Vygotsky trajectory mostly before his formal introduction in the field of psychology, which happened at the Moscow Psychological Institute. So it's kind of, my field is kind of Vygotsky before Vygotsky. And my work is based on four main axes. First, I conduct a survey to compile and translate into Portuguese Vygotsky's text about art, and I provide commentary to them. Then I'm also interested in Vygotsky's take on aesthetic education. Third, I assess the concepts and approaches sketched in the works about art that became relevant to his psychological production per se. And lastly, I discuss the variety of platforms, genres, and target readers that Vygotsky has had throughout his career. We can talk here about multiple Vygotskys, not only the Vygotsky, the psychologist that we know better, but also Vygotsky the critic and Vygotsky the commentator of other theories. My work so far has included the translation of over 90 texts authored by Vygotsky that touches on artistic topics, literature, theater, graphic arts, etc. These are mostly very, very short texts, theatrical reviews, but still it's a quite large corpora that was discussed yesterday by Professor Sopkin, if you probably have seen. And this material was compiled from different sources, including the first volume of the complete works that was organized by Professor Sopkin, but also, because not all materials is included in this volume, also from original sources, like newspapers, local newspapers from Gomel, like Nasz Poniedzielnik, journals like Sowieckie Iskусство, Nowy Put, also a Jewish newspaper from the time. So I had access to this material studying in Russian libraries and archives, and I have compiled all this material this way. Until 1923, Vygotsky worked intensively as a theatrical critic and literary critic in the local press in Gomel, with a large number of reviews and theatrical plays and other events of Gomel's cultural life. As a critic, Vygotsky underwent significant changes from the writing of the essay on the Shakespearean tragedy Hamlet to the theatrical reviews of the mid-20s. A symbolist perspective of art that considered the mystical aspect of the aesthetic experience gives way to a more objective assessment with the discussion of other emerging theories of art, like psychoanalysis and formalism, for instance. So from a predominance of symbolist aesthetic, Vygotsky gradually transferred his worldview, or became influenced by other traditions. In his work as a critic, psychology was not on the foreground. However, Vygotsky gradually developed a properly psychological stance. So he wrote his first work in psychology, which was Psychology of Art. It would be fair, however, to consider that this prior work that was not psychological in principle paved the way to his first major work in psychology, that is The Psychology of Art, written in 1925. With the compilation and translation of this corpus, we are able to analyze the evolution of Vygotsky's stance on art in 3 different moments. As I see it, we have a first moment when he wrote the essay on Hamlet, and then a second moment, the reviews of the Gommel period, and finally the work, Psychology of Art, plus other theoretical texts in psychology already. Around the same time, Vygotsky also wrote about the themes childhood and activity, and creativity, imagination, aesthetic education. Our research line has also worked on this field. One of our main contributions to this topic was the discovery and the translation of a text from the Gommel period entitled On Children Theater from 1922, to which that is published in the first volume of the complete works, the one I showed before, and that I translated into Portuguese and English, and it's available in a journal, in a Brazilian journal. As a theoretical contribution, this line also seeks to trace some concepts developed by Vygotsky in his early work. It has been pinpointed by some authors, for example, González Rey, that later Vygotsky recuperates and reworks certain aspects presented by early Vygotsky. Following this lead, we have been developing some research to trace the occurrences of some psychological concepts in the first writings and follow their evolution. Bearing in mind that the theory is a living and evolving organism that sometimes follows a non-linear path. In this sense, we have so far worked on the occurrences of the notion of sense, smysl, and perigivanie. The works that are on art are particularly fruitful arena to investigate such concepts, since in them it can be found several elaborations about the field of emotions and of cultural science as a means of development. I have written a text, a paper about the tracing the category of sense in Vygotsky's early writing and comparing it to the occurrence in thinking and speech. And I'm working on the topic of perigivanie. I have presented just last week in a roundtable with Professor Veresov about this topic, where I also try to recognize the evolution of this concept in the early writings and how it ends up and how it appears in ulterior work, although I still focus on works about art. In this case, the problem of psychology of the actor's creative work. About the fourth point indicated in the beginning of this talk, I'd like to comment on the multiplicity of tasks performed by Vygotsky. Alongside with the work of critic and cultural activist, Vygotsky engaged in teaching and psychological research. While moving from a critical stance to art towards a properly scientific one, Vygotsky expressed his idea in a variety of formats and platforms: regional papers, literary and scientific journals, books, and essays. This diversity expresses not only Vygotsky's polyvalent talent, but also an engaged attitude, an attitude that does not disconnect science, society, and social transformation. So this would be my last axis of work, and identify how Vygotsky appeared in different arenas, in different platforms, and how he was like a organic whole, integral scientist, and not only like a cabinet scientist, not like working inside the university. And this is very clear in his early work. I have no idea how long I have spoken, but that would be it. Thank you very much for your attention. And I ask to the floor Professor Isabel Razin from Federal do Rio Grande do Norte.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, or rather, good afternoon to you. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Carla Anawati and Dr. Jana Glusman for the invitation. It's an honor for us to be here with many colleagues represent Brazilian historical cultural psychology, which is a vast and diverse, as previously discussed. I am teacher in charge of undergraduate and graduate students in psychology at Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Norte, where I coordinate the Laboratory of Research and Service in Neuropsychology. Finally, I'm presently Vice President of the Latin American Society of Neuropsychology, and I would like to introduce my partners in this section, Hansel Soto Hernandes and Pamela Cadima Coelho, doctorate students at UFRN. Pamela and Hansel, please open the camera, okay?
Hi, good afternoon to you. Good morning, Brazil. Thank you for invitation and good luck, Isabel.
Okay. Okay. The LAPEN was founded in 2007 and since then has had a leading role in the region concerning historical cultural neuropsychology research. LAPEN offers theoretical and service formation covering discipline in both undergraduate and postgraduate courses in psychology, being also in internship area of the psychology undergraduate course. In addition, services are offered in hospital, schools, and the university mental health service, to be present later. Finally, LAPEN today has approximately 25 master's and PhD students, 7 of whom are inserted in the line of research called Theoretical Foundation and Intervention in Historical Cultural Neuropsychology. And Sarah, this is the master students, Sarah Oliveira, investigate the experience of popular musicians during their creative performance. Ronildo Teixeira, who aims to investigate the concepts of intelligence and intellectual disability in Vygotsky works. And Leilani Fossa, she's developed a didactic sequence for teenagers with severe difficulties in reading and writing based on Galperin theory. And doctorate level, Hansel Soto Hernandes intends to produce an instrument of interventional assessment of psychology and neuropsychology development in early childhood. Pamela will validate for Brazil the initial step reading training method developed in Mexico by Dr. Yulia Solovieva. Artemis de Paula is close to the defense and investigated the animation complex and its importance for development in the first year of life. And Mirella Farias works with children with microcephaly associated with the Zika virus, a serious condition that affects many Brazilian children. Presentation made, let me go on by telling about the main target for your integration with the Vershina research group. we aim to development a joint reflection about theoretical, methodological principles underlying the paradigm of historical cultural neuropsychology. We intend to step forward in the establishment of the broad scientific program advanced by historical cultural psychology. From a historical biographic point of view, we are interested in the formation, trajectories, and scientific production flows of Vygotsky and Luria. We try to circumscribe the basic principles that make it possible to describe the process of cogenesis of new forms that characterize the ontogenesis of the high mental function. We also seek to reflect on the Vygotskian ideas. 1. Of natural and cultural development. 2. The principles of defectology, with emphasis on the compensation of defects and plasticity that characterize the function of high mental function. And 3. The principle of the system structure of the task and the extracortical of higher mental functions. So, among Vygotskian principles and constructs, we highlight here those that are considered fundamental either for research or for clinical intervention. The first of these is the Vygotskian conception of disability, worked out in defectology studies. Under this perspective, the findings is not quantitative in nature. We speak of qualitatively different development trajectories, for which cultural development is, per excellence, the way to compensate for the deficit. As Vygotsky said, in the child's cultural development process, some function substitute others, collateral paths are drawn, offering together new possibilities for development of the abnormal child. If an abnormal child cannot achieve sometime by direct means, the development of collateral pathway becomes the base for its compensation. From this conception, a space is opened for the defect compensation process based on the plasticity of higher mental function. The alternative and singular paths make it possible to transform the negative of deficiency into the positive of the compensation. A disabled child represents a qualitatively different type of development. If a blind and a deaf reach the same level of development as normal child, he does it in another way, by another route, by other means. And for the education, it's particularly important to be aware of the uniqueness of this path by which he should guide the child. This uniqueness turns the negative of the deficiency into the positive of the compensation. Finally, the conception of the Finally, the conception of the system structure of the task is a powerful theoretical operator. Whether to think about the teaching learning process or to guide us in the assessment procedure or to propose intervention routes. This is because the structural system analysis of task performance allows us to understand how a task is solved, That is the psychological structure underlying the solution, but also the ways in which performance can be interrupted. We need to be aware that qualitatively different causes may underline incorrect answers. This is the biggest challenge of a classical neuropsychological assessment. Or the same problem is solved by different means. Will have a different structure. And now I would now like to briefly go through some scenarios in which we are managing to intervene in public hospitals, schools, and or in service units at the university. In hospital, we highlight the neuropsychology service and pediatric oncology, especially with children with brain tumors and leukemias. We carry out assessment, guidance to parents, and assist in the installation of the hospital classroom. In the last one, we'll build up different learning and development routes, seeking to compensate for deficit due to cancer in its treatment. In school, we have guided, on the other hand, the local team in structuring learning contexts in nurseries. Use as theoretical reference the tools of the mind proposed by Drs. Bodrova and Leong. These authors offer guidelines for the construction of learning contexts based on Vygotskian principles and always considering that children build up their own knowledge and that development cannot be separated from their social context. In this slide, we see children with microcephaly in the nursery. Microcephaly was here to the contamination by the Zika virus of their mothers during pregnancy. We have been working in order to allow schools to become a place of social emancipation, to become also a crucial element in the construction of an inclusive society. Finally, we have the context of our school clinic, where we accompany children with neurological disorders and learning difficulty. Our evaluative intervention process is structured in 4 stages. 1, qualitative symptoms analysis, investigation, analysis, and comparison of primer change, identification of the altered primer factor and a secondary change, configuration of the system, organization of high psychological function. 2, quantitative assessment, application of test and task with the aim of identifying points of strength and weakness in the child's system neuropsychological functioning. 3, qualitative analysis of the active, observation and analysis of the structure of each task, the errors produced, as well as anticipation of conditions that minimize through mediation the difficulties identified. 4, neuropsychological intervention planning. The intervention methodology is based on 4 principles of the historical cultural approach. 1, election of activities that necessarily involve the weakness of neuropsychological functioning. 2, mediation and gradual internalization of the action involved in overcome the weakness. 3, consideration of the type of support the child needs during the intervention process. And finally, meeting the needs of the child psychological age. We brought here the example of a child with epilepsy, a neurological disorder that affects Hugo, here pseudonym, who used to have hundreds of absence crises in a single day. He also had serious learning difficulties in mathematics. Here, drawing produced by Hugo allowed to realize how much he suffered from the disease and how much mathematics was a great enemy for him. A drawing about being epileptic, he said, "It's very difficult. During the time I was learning to read, I could not understand what was happening to me. I used to look in the sky and fall down. My friends began to give me up. And me and mathematics. Mathematics and I, we are super, hyper, ultra, mega, power, master, blaster enemies. I don't like mathematics." The classic neuropsychological assessment, the initial stage of the process, revealed the significant difficulties in visual speciality. The test showed the difference in performance between Hugo, here, and a child of the same age and socioeconomical level. The drawing revealed significant spatial difficulties. These difficulties present themselves at school with errors in the algorithm of elementary mathematics operation. Here, we propose to Hugo to organize and make a writing operation. Not that the spatial order is incorrect, but the result is correct. Remember the system structure of task, the need to analyze the process and not the product. We noticed that Hugo closed his eyes and wrote the result correctly. When asked why he had closed his eyes, he replied, "Because if you look at it, I make mistakes." Hugo performed the operation by composition, a strategy that failed in the most complex operation. When then decide to use an alternative visual process route, we chose to use colors to represent hundreds, tens, and units. We found that Hugo had no conceptual difficulties and demonstrated the comprehension of the principle of the place value system. We then agreed to use the color red for the hundreds, blue for the tens, and green for the units. By these visual clues, we compensated for visual deficit, and Hugo started to correctly set up the operation. Colors here stand for true cultural process by which the mathematical principle of place value in decimal system could be consolidated. This situation illustrates the path of compensation, a path that we seek daily in all this space in which we are inserted. All these aspects considered, we return to a start point where we defended the importance of this research group. For us, the aim in general is to present arguments that support the thesis that monist and materialist approach to historical cultural psychology is not incompatible with the consideration of the material basis of high psychological function, but necessarily demands the investigation and consideration of such basis. Therefore, the systemic analysis of the function of the human nervous system cannot be excluded from this endeavor. In this journey, we are not hopefully alone. And let us, in this opportunity, to honor and thank you very much the partners and teachers we have been giving us important insights. Doutora Tatiana Akutina, Doutora Jana Glosman, Dr. Aro Tomela, and Doutora Yulia Solovieva. Many thanks once again. Wishing to meet most of you in Natal, Brazil, and the next SCAR Congress.